On a cold January morning in 1926, in a basement laboratory on the campus of Westinghouse in Pittsburgh, a 38-year-old Russian immigrant named Vladimir Zworykin walked up to a cathode ray tube he had been quietly modifying for months, connected it to a crude scanning device, and watched a blurry, flickering image appear on a small glass screen. Nobody filmed the moment. Nobody issued a press release. The image was barely distinguishable. But what Zworykin had produced in that basement was the first serious prototype of electronic television, and the company that would eventually employ him would use that invention to wire every living room in America, dominate global communications for half a century, and then dismantle itself so completely that the name RCA today belongs to a licensing firm that manufactures nothing at all. One company broadcast the first television signal. One company built the first color television standard. One company wired American soldiers in 2 world wars, carried Neil Armstrong's voice from the surface of the moon, and placed a radio in every automobile on the continent. And that same company, flush with cash and blinded by its own success, spent the 1970s buying a car rental service and a frozen food company, while the Japanese electronics industry quietly destroyed it from below. You are watching American Electronics and Tech, where we trace the companies that built the electronic world down to the circuit board and the engineer who designed it. If that kind of history is what you came for, subscribe now and hit the like button, because the story of RCA is not simply a story of invention. It is a story of what happens when a monopoly mistakes its own dominance for permanence. The Radio Corporation of America was not born in a garage or a rented kitchen. It was born in a government office. In 1919, the United States Navy approached General Electric with a specific concern. British Marconi controlled the most powerful wireless radio patent in the world, and American communications infrastructure sat on foreign-owned intellectual property. The Navy wanted an American alternative. GE responded by acquiring the American Marconi Company and folding it into a new entity created specifically for the purpose. They called it the Radio Corporation of America. The founding shareholders were General Electric, Westinghouse, AT&T, and United Fruit Company, which needed reliable ship-to-shore communication for its banana fleets. From its first day of existence, RCA was not a scrappy innovator fighting for survival. It was a corporate instrument of national communication strategy, backed by industrial giants, protected by cross-licensing agreements, and given a mandate to control American radio. The man who made RCA into something more than a patent pool was David Sarnoff. Sarnoff had arrived in America from the Russian Empire at age 9, speaking no English and carrying nothing. He sold newspapers, taught himself telegraphy, and by his early 20s was a radio operator for the Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company of America. He claimed, in a memo that historians have since questioned but never fully disproven, that he was the operator who received distress signals from the Titanic in 1912 and relayed survivor information to the anxious public for 72 consecutive hours. Whether the details were exact or embellished, the story became foundational to his identity and to RCA's mythology. By 1921, Sarnoff was general manager of RCA. By 1930, he was president. He would run the company in one capacity or another for nearly half a century. Sarnoff understood something that most corporate executives of his era did not. He understood that radio was not a communication technology. It was a broadcast technology. The difference was everything. Communication moved between 2 points. Broadcast moved from 1 point to millions. Sarnoff had written a memo in 1916, while still at Marconi, describing what he called a radio music box, a household device that could receive music transmitted through the air and deliver it to any family willing to buy one. His superiors dismissed it. He was right. The radio boom of the 1920s made RCA the fastest-growing company in America and turned Sarnoff into a national figure. But Sarnoff was already looking past radio by the time radio made him famous. Vladimir Zworykin had emigrated from Russia in 1919, carrying a doctorate in electrical engineering and a conviction that electronic television was solvable. He joined Westinghouse, which was an RCA shareholder, and began working on what he called the iconoscope, an electronic camera tube that could convert an optical image into electrical signals without any mechanical scanning parts. In 1929, Sarnoff met Zworykin for the first time. He asked how long it would take and how much it would cost to build a practical television system. Zworykin said 2 years and $100,000. It took 11 years and somewhere between $50 million and $130 million, depending on which accounting is used. Sarnoff never wavered. Standing against RCA was Philo Farnsworth, a self-educated Utah farm boy who had sketched the concept of electronic television on a chalkboard for his high school chemistry teacher in 1922 at the age of 14. Farnsworth filed a patent for his image dissector camera tube in 1927, a year before Zworykin filed a competing patent. The patent battle between Farnsworth and RCA became one of the most significant intellectual property disputes in American history. In 1934, the Patent Office ruled in Farnsworth's favor. It was the first time in its history that RCA had ever lost a patent case. Sarnoff was forced to pay Farnsworth royalties, a humiliation he never forgot and never repeated willingly. On April 30, 1939, at the opening of the World's Fair in Flushing, New York, David Sarnoff stood before a camera and declared that RCA was now introducing a new art to the world. The broadcast went out over NBC, the radio network that RCA had founded in 1926. The image was grainy and the coverage lasted less than an hour, but American television had begun. The Second World War interrupted commercial television before it could take hold. RCA redirected its factories to radar systems, radio communication equipment, and military electronics. The engineers who might have refined the television system instead built devices that would track aircraft and coordinate amphibious landings. When the war ended, RCA emerged with manufacturing expertise, government relationships, and a consumer market hungry for peacetime technology. Between 1946 and 1955, RCA did something no company in American history had done at quite the same scale. It built an industry from nothing and then sold the equipment to watch it. RCA manufactured the cameras that broadcast stations used to capture images. It manufactured the transmitters those stations used to send signals. It manufactured the television sets that American families placed in their living rooms. It owned NBC, the network that produced programming those families watched. And it collected patent royalties from every competitor that built a television set in America, because virtually every television set contained at least one component covered by an RCA patent. By 1955, more than half of American homes owned a television set. The number had been essentially zero a decade earlier. Color television extended the dominance. CBS had developed a competing color system that used a mechanical spinning color wheel and produced richer images than RCA's all-electronic standard. The FCC initially approved the CBS system in 1950. Sarnoff fought the decision with the full legal and lobbying resources of RCA, arguing that the CBS system was incompatible with existing black and white receivers. He was right, and the argument worked. In 1953, the FCC reversed its decision and adopted the RCA-compatible color standard, which became NTSC, the standard that governed American television for the next 5 decades. The color television decision was the single most consequential regulatory victory in the history of American consumer electronics. It locked in RCA's architecture at the foundation of American broadcasting and gave the company a generational head start over every competitor. Sarnoff collected the royalties. NBC broadcast the programming. The factories in Camden, New Jersey ran continuous shifts. Revenue climbed through the 1950s and into the 1960s without meaningful interruption. In 1965, RCA passed $2 billion in annual revenue. In 1967, the company opened the RCA Astro Electronics division to build satellites. In 1969, RCA equipment carried the audio transmission of Neil Armstrong's words from the lunar surface to mission control in Houston. The sentence, "The Eagle has landed," traveled through RCA hardware. David Sarnoff retired in 1970. He died the following year. His son Robert was already running the company, and the conditions that would dismantle everything were already forming. The decline of RCA did not arrive suddenly. It arrived the way most institutional failures arrive, through a series of decisions that seemed defensible in isolation and were collectively catastrophic. The first condition was the computer. Sarnoff had recognized early that computing and electronics would converge. RCA invested heavily in building a computer business through the 1960s, developing a line of mainframes to compete with IBM. In 1971, after spending an estimated $500 million on computer development, RCA's board concluded that the IBM competition was unwinnable and shut the entire division down. The write-off was the largest in American corporate history to that point. Engineers were dismissed. Institutional computing knowledge was scattered. The company that had funded 11 years of television development and one quit the computer business after a decade and never looked back. The second condition was leadership. Robert Sarnoff was removed by the board in 1975. The third condition was Japan. Sony, Panasonic, Toshiba, and Hitachi had spent the 1960s and early 1970s learning to manufacture consumer electronics with a precision and cost efficiency that American factories could not match. They entered the American television market with sets that were cheaper, more reliable, and required less service. American consumers responded in the way consumers always respond to better products at lower prices. They bought them. RCA's share of the American television market fell steadily through the late 1970s. The company invested in a video disc system called Selectivision, which used a mechanical stylus to read information from a vinyl disc the way a record needle reads music. RCA spent $600 million developing Selectivision. It launched in 1981. The VHS videocassette recorder, which allowed consumers to both play and record, had already been on the market for 4 years. Selectivision was discontinued in 1984 after selling fewer than 500,000 units. The $600 million write-off, added to the earlier computer write-down, had consumed capital that might have funded a genuine competitive response to Japanese manufacturing. In 1985, General Electric offered to acquire RCA for $6.28 billion. The board accepted. It was the largest non-oil acquisition in American history at the time. GE was not interested in the electronics business. It was interested in NBC. Within a few years of the acquisition, GE began selling off the pieces. The semiconductor division was sold. The consumer electronics brand was licensed to Thomson of France, which sold it to a series of subsequent owners. The manufacturing facilities were closed or transferred. The engineers were let go. By 1990, RCA as an operating electronics manufacturer had effectively ceased to exist. The brand name continued, attached to products built in factories that had no connection to Camden, New Jersey or the Rockefeller Center offices where Sarnoff had built his empire. The RCA trademark today is owned by a brand licensing company. It appears on televisions assembled in Asia, on headphones sold in discount retailers, on products that carry the letters R, C, and A as a marketing signal with no engineering lineage behind them. The numbers complete the argument in the way that numbers usually do, without sentiment and without mercy. At its peak in the mid-1960s, RCA employed more than 130,000 people worldwide. Its research laboratories in Princeton, New Jersey, known as RCA Labs, employed scientists who held fundamental patents in color television, liquid crystal display technology, and integrated circuit design. For researchers at RCA Labs made contributions to semiconductor physics that shaped the modern electronics industry. The laboratory that produced them no longer exists under that name. The consumer electronics industry that RCA built and briefly dominated is now measured in trillions of dollars annually. None of the leading companies in that industry are American. The manufacturing capacity, the engineering talent, and the patent portfolios that RCA let dissolve have no American successors in consumer electronics. Philo Farnsworth, the farm boy who beat RCA in the patent office and was still forced to watch Sarnoff take the credit for television, died in 1971 with barely enough money to cover his debts. He had spent the final decades of his life fighting for recognition that the television age never fully granted him. His wife Elma, who had been his laboratory assistant and lifelong partner, spent years after his death ensuring that his name appeared in history books where it belonged. Vladimir Zworykin lived to 92, long enough to be asked in an interview whether he was proud of having helped invent television. His answer, frequently quoted and never quite contextualized enough, was that he was not proud of what television had become, only of what it had been intended to be. David Sarnoff is buried at Kensico Cemetery in New York. His gravestone reads simply, Builder. Vladimir Zworykin's cathode ray tube is in the Smithsonian. The RCA building at 30 Rockefeller Plaza still stands, though it is now called 30 Rock. The NBC studios still broadcast from its upper floors. The signal still goes out. The infrastructure still runs. But the company that built all of it, that ran copper wire and broadcast towers across an entire continent, that placed a screen in every American home and carried the voice of the moon to a waiting world, that company is gone. Not because the technology failed. The technology succeeded beyond anything Sarnoff or Zworykin or Farnsworth had imagined in their basements and farm kitchens and patent offices. RCA did not fail to build the future. RCA built the future, collected the royalties, and then spent the proceeds on frozen dinners and car rentals while the future moved on without asking permission. If you worked on RCA equipment in the factories, in the labs, in the broadcast studios, or as a technician keeping those massive television sets running in American living rooms, leave a comment below. Tell us the model, the year, and whether you still have one. The people who built these machines carry more of this history than any corporate filing ever will. Subscribe if this kind of story is what you came here for. The archive of companies that shaped the electronic age is still being built, and the next chapter is already written.